Thank you. Can everyone hear me at the back? Yeah. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today. This is a talk that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. The subject of our talk today is the empire known colloquially as the Ghurids. They're often known as the first major Islamic dynasty to rule from Delhi, the empire that built the Qutb Minar. Here in Rajasthan, they are perhaps best known for fighting with Prithviraj Chauhan, and they feature in folk songs and they feature in epics. There's been movies. I think there was a movie just a few years ago featuring Muhammad Ghori, as he's known. And yet, the dynasty that establishes this empire has been remarkably under-researched. It's often referred to as, to show some sort of break, some sort of eruption where Islam enters violently into India, when, of course, Islam had already been present in India before this dynasty for about 500 years at that point. They bring political Islam, but not the Islamic religion. But I think what makes Alka's work so extraordinary is that she has done something that very few art historians can claim to have done, which is to rewrite the entire history of an empire, one of the most significant empires in medieval South Asian history. She has traveled as a kind of, Indian origin woman across Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, tracking down the forgotten, lost, crumbling monuments of this dynasty, using kind of, old medieval Persian texts to try and trace the lost remnants of this dynasty. And in doing so has pieced together a rather extraordinary story that challenges, I think, much of the received wisdom that we thought we knew about them. For example, despite the fact that here they are often known and regarded as the kind of quintessentially, temple-destroying, kind of strict interpretations of Islam, this dynasty is actually raised to power by Jewish merchants in Afghanistan, and are arguably the first to begin adopting kind of, Hindu and North Indian architectural styles as far away as Afghanistan and Iran. And we're going to hear more from Alka in a moment. But it's an incredible story. And so the way that this is going to work, Alka's going to give about 25 to 30-minute presentation. We're going to move into a little interview format for the rest of the talk and then open a few questions to the audience at the end. So get thinking about questions in advance. Thank you all. And Alka, let's hear from you.
Thanks so much, Sam. Is it on? It's a very generous introduction. Thanks so much, Sam. And also thank you and to the festival for an opportunity that's really much too rare, which is to speak with people outside of just the research ambit, because really I would hope that the work that is done has a much wider life, and it will be a much more compelling contribution, I think, if more people, I'm able to communicate the findings to more people.
Could we get the PowerPoint on stage to the tech team? Brilliant.
Okay. So I think everybody is familiar with this image, but, well, not with the image, but with the monument. And the reason that I chose it is because it actually speaks to the notoriety, I think, certainly from the monumental perspective of this particular period of South Asian history. As was already mentioned by Sam, the so-called Ghurids of Afghanistan are responsible for constructing certainly the mosque complex known as the Qutb complex, or as the Quwwat al-Islam, and its attendant minar, the Qutb Minar. And the monument really was representative of so much of historical India, to the point where also, I don't know if the pointer, anyway, as you can see, it was actually a French aristocrat who was traveling in northern India, who took the pains to drag photographic equipment to the site and photograph actually pre-1857. So it's an interesting set of photographs. My interest in the so-called Ghurids, and I will provide the alternative name that I believe historically they were known as, has always been much more than simply this idea of encounter. What has really interested me is the actual mechanics of the encounter. And as somebody who is enamored of buildings and of the physical environment, I believe that they are some of the most compelling indices of historical processes. So, and I think that they are really demonstrative of the mechanics of encounter that other media perhaps are in different ways, but I have spent my time documenting buildings and meeting the people who interact with them. So the so-called Ghurids, and as you can see in this little map in the corner, they are considered really a very ephemeral political formation. But in my research, and I think they should be actually ascribed a much larger historical significance than has been the case in the past. And part of this, I think, is the fact that they, in fact, initiated a certain historical momentum. It wasn't the Ghaznavids, but in fact, these folks, the so-called Ghurids, who in fact set up a much longer-term political presence in northern India, as Sam made reference to, and although their, of course, imperial life cycle came and went, it's interesting that in their wake, there were a series of these newcomers that came from the Northwest, a different series of adventurers, power seekers, who nevertheless followed in these same footsteps, if you will, and eventually established what we think of as the Sultanate of Delhi, collectively including usually the Khaljis and the Tughlaqs, and ultimately also disseminated this, these various political formations that were Islam affiliated really throughout what we could think of as the subcontinent. I've highlighted Delhi in red because really it was because of this historical momentum that Delhi really was transformed from more of a satellite kind of secondary capital to places such as Ajmer and various other large capital cities, if you will, of the various Chahamana dynasties, into really the fulcrum of political power in northern India. And it was reinscribed with, in fact, these series of newcomers that came and took advantage of their own perhaps superior military power, etc., to create these sequential political formations. And the culmination of these activities, I don't know why it's not advancing, I'm sorry. Is it?
Point this way.
Ah.
Could we have the next slide, please?
There. So, for that little thing, I'm sorry. So in fact, oops, there was a culmination in the Mughal Empire with this succession of newcomers into northern India. So because of this historical significance, hopefully that's becoming more clear, for a very long time, since I was a student, in fact, this particular series of historical processes has been, I think, very, well, meaningful for me to pursue. So finally, after a couple of other projects were done, I was able to dedicate myself to what I thought would be one volume, but in fact, it's turned out to be two. The first volume is what Sam introduced, and as you can see, it covers the second half of the 12th century, essentially. So I wanted to say a few words about the use of these terminologies such as Iran, India, and Afghanistan. Clearly, Iran and India in the 12th century, it would be anachronistic to think of them as bounded political nation states. For the purposes of a sort of snappy title, if you will, I actually have used these terms to indicate very kind of permeably defined cultural spheres. The Indic world, the Indic cultural sphere, and the Iranian or the Persianate cultural sphere. And it is indeed in what is the modern nation state of Afghanistan that fascinating encounters, again, take place. So I did want to make that clear that obviously the book was not talking about Iran and India, but in fact, the much larger cultural stratigraphies that are to be found in these geographical expanses. So as I mentioned, this is the first volume, and the second I have tentatively titled with reference to something of a reverse process, which is India to Iran. And I will take this opportunity both to tell you a little bit about the first volume, but perhaps now more significantly for me to also think ahead. So what I mean by the mechanics of encounter is, and again, as Sam had made reference, previously there had been mercantile and other communities really throughout historical India from virtually the first years of the Islamic calendar. And of course, these communities made their home in Southern or South Asia, but it was really with the establishment of a more firm foothold by the so-called Ghurids that we have these monumental constructions. Perhaps the best known, or one of the very well-known examples, is the Qutb complex, to which we made reference earlier. And of course, you see a much more recent photograph of the Minar than the 1849 photograph of the Baron Auguste de Lagrange. So I did want to say that one of the most rewarding, perhaps, parts of this project, and in actually tracing the mechanics of encounter through the built form, through the physical environment, afforded me the opportunity. I'm sorry, it's kind of, okay, there we go. Let's stay here. The tracing of the mechanics of encounter really afforded me the opportunity to go to the so-called Iranian cultural world. And this was not only in the central Seljuk lands around Isfahan and the Isfahan oasis, but indeed also in the great epic sort of historical region of Khorasan in northeastern Iran and western Afghanistan. And these structures, as I will indicate a little bit later in the presentation, collectively speaking, they represented these modes of facture and these modes of creating built environments that were deeply impactful on the types of architectural practices that we saw take root and develop in incredibly innovative ways. as a result of the Ghurid, or as I say, the Shansabanis presence in northern India. Of course, not only as far afield as Iran, but indeed also in Afghanistan, it was necessary to conduct field work. Afghanistan, as we know, has had variable levels of access, particularly perhaps for women. And so I have to say that it kind of attests to the perhaps commitment of researchers that were not giving up due to the lack of access. Now, there are incredible archives which have very, very much to offer to projects such as mine, and these include historical photographs, indeed, of structures that no longer exist. The King of Afghanistan in the mid-20th century, in a kind of modernization project, unfortunately had the principal Ghurid tomb, a doors to the northern part of the Herat Mosque, dismantled because it wasn't in good shape. But thankfully, it was quite well documented in the photography of the Swiss architect Rudi Stuckart, but also others. And I have to make mention of the intrepid Josephine Powell, the American photographer who did an incredible service to subsequent generations by documenting structures and also people all around Afghanistan that now really serve as kind of vicarious, if you will, primary sources. And it's thanks to her work that we also have an opportunity to see the magnificent Minar of Jam in the very center of Afghanistan, which I'll refer to a little bit more in just a moment. So all of this extensive field work and the actual experience of documenting as much as possible of the Iranian cultural world, and that also would extend into these kind of interstices between Greater India and Iran, which fall within modern Afghanistan. What that actually made clear to me is that the so-called Ghurids were an incredible group of people. I have an immense admiration for them, and the historical evidence, in my view, points to the fact that it was a group of nomadic peoples who, through a series of charismatic leaders as well as incredible political acumen and no small degree of historical luck, of course, came to be increasingly prominent over the surrounding populations. So what anthropologists and archaeologists now think of as the nomad urban continuum was the sort of place of origin or the locus of origin of this group of people. This is a spectrum with very soft ends. There is really no such thing as a pure nomad nor a pure sedentist. Hence this continuum, since really from human civilization's birth, there has always been a kind of symbiotic relationship between mobile populations and the more sedentist ones. So again, relying on the generosity and decades and generations of previous field work, and also the textual sources that describe the Ghurids' beginnings, we get a sense of the fact that their origins, if you will, were very much in the center of what is present-day Afghanistan in the historical region of Ghur, hence this name of Ghuri, essentially an adjective that describes their place of origin. There was a seasonal migration of these communities from the banks of the Harirud, which would have been their summer encampments, down south to the historical region of Zamindavar. Curiously, the textual sources, I think we see their sort of limits, if you will, or at least the conventions that they subscribe to, when, there is actually no hard and fast indication, certainly not by, a geolocation, of course, but we can only conjecture as to what the actual localities were that this group of people operated. And indeed, Zamindavar is a bigger question for their overwintering grounds, because there is no sense of precisely where these winter encampments would have been. Hence, the circle on the map is much bigger. And one of the questions that I try to answer in the first volume is how it is that a group of nomads, if you will, came to form essentially an imperial confederacy. And I've proposed that it was through the kind of both the discernment as well as the deployment of three spheres, overlapping spheres of activity. And these three spheres would have been a very conscious and public Islamic confessionalism. There is an incredibly rich literature grounded in intrepid and admirable fieldwork by generations of anthropologists who have followed, for instance, nomadic communities throughout Iran as well as modern Afghanistan, really looking at the relationship between the kind of doctrinal religions and their various manifestations in the worlds of incredibly varied and diverse populations. So this Islamic identity was something that was cultivated sort of in the service of creating an imperial identity. There was also nothing like, if we have sort of a surplus, we will invest in cultural projects or production. Indeed, arguably, cultural patronage was integral and fundamental to creating as well as maintaining empires. And finally, the inherited kind of senses of mobility that many of these so-called nomadic populations of central Afghanistan, and indeed the larger Iranian world, stood them in very good stead as they began to command larger and larger distances. And this was actually what anthropologists have referred to as a nomadic cultural capital that allowed these groups of people who, after coming into a regional prominence, to actually command vast geographies as they arrived at a trans-regional prominence. So, if we were to take all of these considerations to perhaps at least one logical conclusion, we could argue that in fact a culture of power is somewhat egalitarian. It is accessible to any group of people who really has the discernment to figure out, the acumen to see what those tools are, a certain amount of charisma and ability to command cultural capital as well as material capital, and of course, we already mentioned historical accident. So one of the main arguments of my work is that nobody is born an elite necessarily. In fact, there are, of course, lots of inheritances and so forth with any dynasty that is established, but cultures of power, in theory, are open to vast and varied populations. So what did this development from a tribe to an empire really look like? And this was also a very different kind of empire, not a monolithic one that was sort of top-down, but arguably one that was much more of a loose confederacy. So we have three principal lineages that eventually developed, and indeed these lineages were located at different areas as this particular family, no longer kind of a generic Ghuri, but in fact, as their poets and historians, referring to that investment in cultural patronage, they were in fact sort of given, if you will, this dynastic name of the Shansabanis. So I think it is important to distinguish this group of people from Ghurids in general, since that is a much more generic term that is much more of a regional toponymic. And interestingly, even within the homelands of modern Afghanistan, each one of these lineages looked different depending on the location that you took. So it's the proverbial elephant and its various parts. I think it's extremely important to strive towards an overall view rather than depending only on one particular perspective, because I think that, in fact, does not, it is inaccurate rather than at all enlightening. It's important to understand that people rule according to the context, and indeed this speaks to the discernment and acumen to which I made reference. These groups of people were extremely astute, and they saw the type of rulership that was most efficacious in each one of their locations. So when we look at the supposedly one of the earliest, by a few years, the sort of senior Shansabani lineage in central Afghanistan at the site of Jam Firuzkoh and the famous Minar, the material cultural remains there actually are at variance from the other lineages. Their agnates who were ruling in Bamiyan inherited essentially a centuries-old cosmopolitan region that had been well connected to really the distances of northern Asia and the steppe regions. And so they mobilized and really capitalized on those resources to create a rulership and perform kingship that was most appropriate to that context. So, and ultimately, we have the conquest, finally, of the waning Ghaznavids and the third Shansabani lineage installing itself in the once glittering capital of Ghazna, which had fallen on some bad times because of the demise of the Ghaznavids, but ultimately it was also a capital city for this third lineage of the Confederacy, and there was an extensive kind of refurbishment, not so much a rebuilding that wasn't necessary, but there was an adoption of the trappings of power that were already in place. So as we can see, this confederacy, again, each one of its leaders and rulers was observant and able to adapt to rule most efficaciously in the location that they were in, taking advantage of the heritage, the traces of history that were left. And so when we turn our attention to northern India eventually and the eastward expansion into first modern Pakistan and ultimately into northern India, we're really talking principally about the Ghazna branch of the Confederacy rather than this kind of undifferentiated, monolithic Ghurid dispensation. It was really the Ghazna lineage that was in many ways extremely enterprising, but they also inherited this socioeconomic and political momentum of their predecessors, the Ghaznavids. So again, speaking to these very location-specific forms of both rulership as well as expansion. So this is, I thought that I could dispense with all of this information in a couple of chapters in one book and move really to, you know, what was happening in the Northern Indian context, but that was not to be, because there is an incredible amount of information that I think we need to have, again, that elephant and its parts, in order to understand what their subsequent activities were. So in my mind, we cannot know what they did or why they did it without knowing where they came from and what plausible kind of processes of emergence they went through. So now when eventually, actually, presently, I am writing the second volume, and that will focus on these mechanics of encounter in northern India, the Qutb, of course, being the best known complex. What I plan to show is that not only was there a heritage of these architectural practices of the Iranian world and their innovation and adaptation to the circumstances of northern India, but in fact, we can even plausibly identify at least the periods of the fragments that were eventually reutilized in the monumental constructions that were a hallmark really of Shansabanis presence in northern India. So as many of you might be familiar, in addition to, of course, the building in Delhi, there are at least 4 other complexes that have been ascribed to the Ghazna Shansabanis in North India, and I have proposed that there could be actually 2 more smaller structures. Now, all of these would be undergoing in the second volume this kind of analysis of the mechanics of encounters. So all of the field work that was done in Iran and Afghanistan indeed will be really bearing fruit, if you will, as I turn my attention to northern India in particular. Finally, I did want to say that the reason that I had adopted kind of the reverse process name for the second volume is that encounters and the mechanics thereof are inevitably always mutual or reciprocal. So again, it was not the case that simply there was kind of a receptivity or reception of these foreign forms in northern India because of the demands on the skilled laborers to create structures that were quite new within the Indic building practices. But indeed, there was a dissemination of the ways of building and of even conceiving of the built form that were transmitted westward. So while the examples of these kinds of westward transmissions appear to be quite few, actually this might be a function of the fact that so much of the country perhaps has simply not been as documented. And we have to also think about these divisions in the historiographies and traditions of scholarship, where there is a whole kind of intellectual tradition of focusing on Islamic architecture as opposed to Indian or South Asian architecture. But in fact, we are talking about the very same actual physical structure. So just as the structure united these architectural traditions, I think it is important to intertwine intellectually as well. So we essentially have to know what we're looking at. And finally, I wanted to end with this idea that the Moguls have always loomed large, you know, in the historiography of historical India. And yet we cannot think of them as something of an explosion out of nowhere, if you will, or an instantaneous phenomenon. Indeed, they were the culmination, as I said before, of these historical momenta that were arguably initiated by the Shansabani expansions eastward, certainly in the 12th century. So I will end there.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Yes. So we've got about 10 minutes left. And so I wanted to open with probably 2 questions, and then we'll hand over to the audience for the rest. But the first one, I just wanted to ask a bit about the fieldwork. I mean, it sounds very exciting and very kind of Indiana Jones, the idea of you kind of traipsing around sort of remote villages in search of, you know, the missing links of this dynasty. And as you mentioned, you briefly touched upon the fact that you have kind of discovered some new examples of Ghurid architecture that had never really been documented before. And I'd like you to just first touch a little on that and what it was, how you discovered them, what sources, did you have a kind of map, you know, with X marks the spot that you were looking for, mentions in medieval texts, or how did you come across these sites?
So there definitely were some textual references. The Shansab were astute, as we talked about, and did indeed invest in this cultural patronage of having poets and historians on the payroll that talked about who they were to transmit this information, this knowledge to posterity. So that was one starting place, but really it was an interdisciplinary search in that the epigraphic remains from generations of Indian epigraphists and archaeologists have been collecting, editing, and transcribing, and in some cases translating. So the epigraphic or inscriptional evidence, sometimes completely dissociated from buildings, is important. And sometimes there are some fascinating dissonances between textual description and the actual physical environment. In that the site of Firuzkoh is a perfect example where the principal Shansab historian Minhajuddin Siraj Juzjani, his description of this capital of this particular Shansabani lineage apparently was replete with a multi-level palace and so forth, but archaeologically no such structure was unearthed. And this speaks to the fact that textual sources were actually operating with a different series of not only conventions, but really playing out a very different series of aims and appealing to different audiences. So, and this was perhaps the first clue that many of those nomadic or transhuman ancestral ways indeed were maintained for the imperial Shansabanis as well. So there was never just some kind of linear evolution, if you will. Again, it was very site-specific, the way that they operated.
Are there any places mentioned in Juzjani that have been lost, that you went looking for, but today have just been built, concreted over, and that, you know, any of the great masterpieces that are mentioned in the text that don't appear?
Well, sadly, there is quite a bit of deterioration. The one other kind of interesting, idea that proves that textual sources were operating on a different level is that, and this is true of the Persian kind of historical tradition throughout, in that many times the places that were mentioned are virtually impossible to find because the reckoning of distance and descriptions, of course, are very different from the way that we as 21st century observers would ourselves document or describe sites.
I think we've got time for possibly one, maybe 2 questions, if there are any people. Maybe the man at the front over here. Do we have a microphone? Right, second row, there's a man with his hand up. Oh, and yes, lady in the sari. If we could pass a mic to the man and woman standing up now, you can start.
Hello, good afternoon. I had one question. When you talk about Ghurids, they were invaders and nomadic. What drew them to the northern Indian, so as to say, the subcontinent? What was their aim to come here and conquer, so as to say?
So it's an excellent question. Again, to reiterate, we're talking about the Ghazna lineage of the Confederacy, not all of the Shansabani lineages. But in my estimation, I think that it was a kind of going farther of what their predecessors, the Ghaznavids, had embarked on, which is, of course, the Ghaznavids, putatively, actually conducted these raids for sort of smash and grab, but there weren't actual ambitions for a longer-term politico-economic link or an annexation of the North Indian plains. Arguably, the Ghaznavid imperial formation was much more kind of westward, if you will, focused, because at once upon a time, during the reign of Sultan Mahmud, of course, the westernmost boundaries went all the way to Rai in central Iran. So it was a very different both tradition of kingship. It was a very different set of economic sources. And so the relationship really of the Ghaznavids with northern India was something that I think the Shansabani Ghazna lineage took further, which was that now there was a true fragmentation. We're talking about a confederacy that was only loosely aligned. So there wasn't like a central coffer from which all of these lineages were supported. Each one was on their own. So the Ghazna lineage, in my view, actually thought of this annexation as a way of sustaining this dynastic line.
I think we have a second question just in front here.
Hello. Hi, Sam and Alka. I'm Dr. Ahmed Al-Mazmi. I teach history at UAE University. And as somebody who worked on Balochistan, I'm happy to hear that somebody is working on the space in between, because most of the scholarship that we have is about Iranians in India, but skipping over the space in between that we don't learn about, whether that's Afghanistan or Balochistan or Sindh for that matter. In reading your work, I'm interested in your notion of translation, and this is I'm connecting with Barry Flood's work, Objects of Translation, which is on earlier period and on Sindh. And I'm interested in how do you read this translation, whether from religion to religion or from language to language, through numismatic, coins, architecture. How does that figure in your work? How do you see translation playing out between Iran and India through the Shansabanis? Thank you.
It was a little hard to hear, but I think I got the gist of the question. I guess I've actually long admired Barry's work. You referred to the Objects of Translation book. But again, what I started saying in the beginning was, for me, encounter is not enough. I call it a contrarian sort of, overly analytical nature, but I want to know the mechanics of this encounter. And so translation, while that is one way to understand the way that forms are transformed, I think that actually curtails an understanding rather than opening new ones. And what I mean by that is, I would much rather, well, it's not a preference, I think that it is more productive to look at change as something that comes from within, let's say, loosely bounded or established building or making traditions. And so the mechanisms of innovation and the impetuses for innovation are really what what fascinate me. And they're continually giving me a sense of admiration for the creativity, in fact. You know, I mean, this idea that tradition and creativity are somehow antithetical, I don't think that that is true at all. In fact, it is true creativity to have an established set of norms and take them farther to meet new needs, right? That, so, you know, translation, again, is a way to open sort of the door of looking at changes, but I don't think the story ends there. I think there's more to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but I think we'll have a signing desk, or please grab Alka after the session if you would like any more questions. Thank you so much for being an attentive audience, and please give your hands up for Alka Patel.